In these two works that we're looking at here, the Letter from a Birmingham Jail and the I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King is going to talk at many points about nonviolence as the means to try to achieve what he's calling racial justice, the response to long enracinated and perpetuated conditions of injustice, of inequality, of exploitation. And what we want to look at in this portion is how he's framing, what he's telling us about the workings of nonviolent resistance. So he talks much more about this in the Letter from a Birmingham Jail, so much of the quotations and discussions are going to be from there. But there is an important passage in the I Have a Dream speech that we'll talk about. And you notice I've got two things here. One is sort of a list of the parts of a campaign that he talks about early on in the jail letter. And then I've got this diagram here that's having to do with the power structure, with the tension that's underlying it, and we'll be visiting that in some detail in a few minutes. So early on in his speech, he says, in a nonviolent campaign, there's 4 basic steps. So nonviolent resistance, at least the way that Martin Luther King conceives of it, isn't something that just spontaneously happens. You know, there's some oppression and people say, oh, we got to do something about this. It actually takes some thinking out, some coordination. There's a method to it. That's not to say there isn't any spontaneity involved. There's no reacting to local circumstances. There's no improvisation, because this is actually, as he says, creative in its workings. It's manifesting a different kind of creativity, but something that's more akin to what is going on with the artist's response to his or her material, and trying to work out classic themes like that of suffering and justice, and less like some sort of textbook, here's exactly how it's done, doctrinaire approach. He says the first thing you have to do is actually collect facts. Before deciding that, well, we should have some resistance, we should actually collect facts to see whether indeed injustice is being committed. He says we have to determine whether injustices exist. So not every situation is a situation ripe or ready for nonviolent action. As a matter of fact, there could be plenty of times where people are calling for nonviolent protest where no real injustice is existing. In this case, he says, it's pretty clear that in Birmingham there is injustice. As a matter of fact, in the whole of the South and the whole of the United States at that time, there is injustice, but particularly in Birmingham. So we're not going to talk anymore about collecting the facts, but that is something important to point out, that King doesn't think that this is a technique or a method that you just apply to every sort of situation dogmatically. He thinks that you have to go on a case-by-case basis. Then there's negotiation. And what he's talking about as negotiation, you should think of in terms of presenting demands, in terms of trying to call people's attention to what sort of abuses are taking place. It requires, instead of simply going out and protesting, that one actually try to work within the system that exists, try to reach out to the people that one can contact and say, look, what's wrong here? Why are you doing this? Why are you tolerating this? Why are you imposing this on other people? Don't you understand that this is the wrong thing to do? So this is a key element in any sort of nonviolent protest, in any sort of nonviolent action. Before you get to the marches, the boycotts, all that sort of stuff, there has to be talking. And now notice what this involves. This has to be dialogue. King talks at a certain point about the South as having been run too long by a monologue and not giving way to genuine dialogue. The oppressed in this model actually have to make some sort of effort to reach out to the oppressor and say, what you're doing is wrong. Here's how it's wrong. Here's why it's wrong. Why don't you stop it? Why don't you fix this? They have to treat, in short, the oppressor as if the oppressor is not just an evil person or some sort of mechanism or a robot inflicting penalties and punishments and inequalities everywhere, just for the sake of doing so, but as an actual human agent. somebody who's capable of making a decision to leave behind wrong and evil and turn towards good and justice. After that, King says, then you have these two parts of the procedure. Self-purification. The protesters in the South who were working with the nonviolent civil rights movement actually underwent quite a lot of training. Why did they undergo this sort of training? Because the leadership didn't want anyone out there who was going to lose their cool under terrible pressure and suddenly start acting in ways that would give the white police a chance to retaliate. That all has to do with what's going on down here. The self-purification has to do for preparation for a conflict with genuine evil, where one knows that one is going to be hurt, where there's a potentiality even for losing one's life, where one has already been treated as lacking in dignity. So, he says, we've gone through these steps in Birmingham. We realized that after negotiation had broken down, we had no alternative but to prepare for direct action. And he says, we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. Mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. What did that consist in? We began a series of workshops on nonviolence. We repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? And those who were not able to do that couldn't be part of the protest movement. Why not? Because if you're going to, as he says, if we're going to present our bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the national community, that is, subject oneself as a bodily being, as a physical being, to the brutality, to the violence of other people, so that the national community and the local community can see it and say, this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening. One has to be able to at least appear not to be the aggressor, not to be retaliating in kind. We'll talk about why that's so important a bit later. So then we get to the fourth phase, which is direct action. Notice that, again, a lot of people want to jump right here. King says, if you're actually going to be engaging in nonviolent action, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this first. You can't simply go on to direct action. There are conditions that govern whether one can do that. Because the direct action will not be effective in attaining its purposes if you don't actually go through these stages. Now he tells us some very interesting and important and distinctive things about the nature of nonviolent direct action. One is that I didn't actually put it here on the board. He says, this is in response to the religious leaders who say, why aren't you just focused on negotiation? King says direct action is actually supposed to lead back to negotiation. It's not done for its own sake. It's actually a means to an end. And this is actually a means to another end. The ultimate end is racial justice. That's the far off, eyes on the prize to be seeking. The immediate end is a bettering, an improvement of conditions, and a recognition of the injustice of the conditions preceding it. That comes ultimately through negotiation, but in many cases that can only happen with direct action. Why? Because as we've seen, as he talks about, it's very rare that those who are involved in oppressing others, those who are benefiting from an unjust arrangement of society, are going to suddenly say, yeah, let's fix this. There are very few cases where that's happened in history, but usually it takes some sort of catalyzation, some sort of changing of perspective in order for that to happen. And the way that perspective changes is by people talking and people doing things that send a message or send several messages. So, what else does he say? Direct action has to be carried out in a spirit of love and nonviolent protest. So let's talk about this for a bit. What does it mean to love one's enemies? Because that's what he's talking about here. The Christian injunction to turn the other cheek, to love one's enemies, to not retaliate, to not give in to anger. Does it mean that one has to have warm, fuzzy feelings towards one's enemy, that one has to, get them things on Valentine's Day? No, we're talking about a very different conception of love here, which means to choose, to do, to exhibit goodness towards those who are bad, to bless those who curse you, is one of the injunctions went. A person who can actually do that sets a very powerful model that can quite often break through the long sedimented structures that keep people compartmentalized into this type and this type and this type. And I'm not going to deal with you because you're over here and you're no good. But it takes a lot to be able to do that. It requires a commitment that gets made over and over and over again. And every time that the other person behaves like a jerk towards you, or even worse, behaves like a tyrant, a bully, an oppressor, a murderer even towards you, it's a new challenge to be able to do that. That's why this self-purification was so centrally important. They would actually practice getting mistreated. Some of the people, they role play so that they could handle it when they encountered it. Nonviolent protest. This means not throwing bottles, not throwing bricks, not resisting those who are actually going to be using violence against them. And in this case in Birmingham, it was sending police dogs against people to bite them, to attack them. It was spraying them with fire hoses, and fire hoses meant very high pressure water that could take a person and just throw them against a wall, or could actually take off skin at the pressure that they were pumping it through. It meant police batons. It meant in some cases being shot. So nonviolent protest means standing up and saying, this is wrong, that over there is wrong, what you're doing here is wrong, but I'm not going to retaliate against you. So that's the spirit that Martin Luther King is calling for. At another point, he says that the means, the ways in which this is done, must be as pure as the ends. That it doesn't make any sense to try to pursue a great end, namely racial justice, which includes a sense of reconciliation, of brotherhood, of human beings, of recognizing people for the persons that they are and not just by skin color, aiming for that, judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. All of that is the end. And Martin Luther King is saying that the means the means by which they have to pursue that have to be as good, have to be as pure, have to be as nonviolent as those ends. So that precludes any sort of, well, in this case it's justified for me to kick that guy. In this case it's justified for me to shoot somebody else in return. He talks about creative tension. And this is a really important idea involved in nonviolent protest, nonviolent action in the face of injustice. And we're going to come back to that when we look at this diagram. I want to talk a little bit more, though, about this notion that he has early on. He says, nonviolent direct action seeks to create a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate, so negotiation has not worked, is forced to confront the issue. How so? It seeks to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. Now, what does it mean to dramatize an issue? To inject drama in it? Does it mean that everybody should make up some big stories and inflate things? No, what it means is the streets literally become a stage. Everything becomes part of a human drama. Everybody exists in one big fishbowl where other people are looking on and seeing the action that's taking place. The word drama originally comes, by the way, from the word for action. Aristotle talks about this in his Poetics. And King knows this because he's actually studied these things when he was in college and divinity school himself, as we know actually from reading his papers that he wrote. So to dramatize this means that there's going to be an oppressive force that has been oppressive all this time, and now other people are standing up and saying, we're going to be the victims. We're going to be the victims because we're going to confront them, the people who have said no to us over and over and over again, and we're going to say, you should be saying yes. You should be letting us do what we need to do. You should be treating us as equals. You should not be oppressing us. You should actually be doing the opposite of that. And then they're going to get attacked. And this happens in the eyes of the community. Not only the local community, but also the national community. So they want to have this publicized. Why do they want to have this publicized? Not to make a big deal of themselves, but so that they can be in a role where they are actually being seen as what they are, an oppressed victim standing up against prejudice and oppression and being beaten down. They want to provoke something on the part of the audience, namely a crisis of conscience, a saying, this is wrong. We shouldn't be going along with this. I didn't know that things were this bad. That sort of reaction. That's what nonviolent direct action is supposed to be doing. It's not just saying your piece. It's not just coming out and marching around and engaging in sort of that kind of drama. It's actually doing a sort of play in which one ends up being the main character, but it's in a certain sense a tragedy. He talks about in the I Have a Dream speech, talks about this as well. He's got this wonderful line about meeting physical force with soul force. And he says, we must conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. And once again, that self-purification is a matter of introducing discipline, rather than being sort of an undisciplined rabble just rising up and saying, we're not going to take this, let's throw some bottles, let's break some windows. It's requiring an awful lot of discipline to stand up to oppression when you know that you're probably going to be on the wrong side of the nightstick. So the high plane of dignity, not allowing the people who are trying to keep them from having dignity to impose it upon them, not allowing themselves to degenerate to the level of those who just use fraud or force or fear or intimidation. He says we must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. And King goes on to say that in that speech and also in the letter, that this doesn't just mean not getting physically violent with people. And the not getting physically violent doesn't mean that one doesn't, resist being taken away by laying still, or it doesn't mean that one can't get in between an oppressor and their victim. It just means that one is not actually engaging in aggression. But it's also possible to mess this up by the way one feels. And King thinks that it's difficult, but one has some control over how one feels by thinking about the way one frames things. So he goes on and he says, the marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to distrust all white people. So distrust is one of those things. Hatred, bitterness, he talks about these. Meeting physical force with soul force requires that one actually try to rid oneself of these negative emotions, which is very hard to do, and certainly not to act on those emotions towards the other as those emotions would have one want to. Now, let's talk about tension. Again, he says, we want to dramatize the issue, negotiation. Nonviolent direct action is supposed to create a crisis after negotiation fails and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. And this word tension is, King feels, almost kind of a dirty word. So whoever is introducing tension is really causing a lot of trouble. And he talks a lot about the power structure. The power structure, I'm being oversimplistic here. I know that there's class distinctions and all that, but I want to keep this very simple. The power structure, in short, in segregation is whites are on top, blacks are on the bottom. And how is this maintained? By force coming down this way, right? There's also, to some degree, a alienation process that happens down here that we'll talk about in a moment. But for the most part, what keeps this in place is power going down. And it can be physical power, the threat of physical force. It can be economic power, the threat of losing one's precarious economic existence. It can be social power. It can be all sorts of modes of power. But power is imposed. And this introduces a certain tension, a tension which is not felt by the people who are on top. So they can say, oh, you're introducing tension into it, but that tension is there the whole time, because anytime that you're placing people under duress, you're introducing tension into the system. So, Martin Luther King says, my citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking. But I must confess I'm not afraid of the word tension. I've earnestly opposed violent tension. What is violent tension? It's this, where the tension has to do basically with force. Think to yourself about, a mechanism in which a spring is compressed down, and if the lever goes, suddenly that spring will shoot forth. That's violent tension. Tension can lead to things actually breaking if they can't bend far enough, or if they become brittle because of being kept under too much tension. Sometimes when the tension is released, the spring can't come forth all the way too. But this is the violent tension that King says is already there. He says there is a constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. That sort of tension is going to come from below. And it's going to involve all of these, or at least some of them, more and more as the struggle goes on. So he says, the purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. And he talks here about monologue and dialogue. The goal, again, is to lead to negotiation by introducing a different kind of tension there. This kind of tension just makes people anxious, makes them willing to use force against each other, makes them willing to perpetuate injustice against each other. Creative tension treats people as fully human beings. Here's the thing, when it comes to that, to treat another person as a human being is not always to say, yeah, you're A-okay the way that you are. If that person is involved in things that are destructive to themselves or to others, to treat them as a human being is actually to call them on that and say, look at what you're doing. Look what the effects are on these other people. Do you want to be like that? And in that asking them, do you want to be like that, or do you want something better, you're actually treating them as a human person, to convict them in that sense, as the word goes, to convict somebody's conscience. He goes on and he talks a bit more about tension a little bit later on. He says that he's talking about white moderates. And unfortunately, white moderates have gone along with this system. The segregationists can be counted on to just keep the power structure in place because, they want to keep segregation a reality. But then there's this whole body of the white moderates that King says, I feel very disappointed in them because they don't want to see the tensions that are there. He said, I'd hope the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. So he's talking there about the ultimate goal that we're going to talk about more in one of the other videos about racial justice. So the white moderates are unwilling to see the violent tensions that's there, and when a new tension is introduced, the creative tension, let's put it down here, by those who have been oppressed actually saying that's enough and we want to end this situation, the white moderates don't want to go along with that and they reject it. They support the segregationists thereby. So he says, what we want to do is bring to surface this hidden tension. We want people to see this for what it is. We want them to recognize that there is a power structure in place that is, imposing power downward from those who are on top to those who are placed on the bottom, who don't deserve to be at the bottom. We do this by bringing up a creative tension from below. So he says, we bring it out into the open where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. So again, that is what nonviolent action is supposed to do, to introduce this creative tension by making people look at what is actually happening, by showing them what the power structure is doing, and by also showing them what other people who aren't in the power structure are doing and what they're suffering as a result. You notice I've got a few other things down here as well. King talks about nonviolent resistance as being in between two extremes, in between the extreme of accommodating and an extreme position of violent resistance to oppression. We're going to talk a little bit more about this a little bit in another video. But the accommodating people are the ones who have been suffering, and they have gotten so beaten down that even though there is this tension, and even though they're forced to absorb most of the damage that this tension imposes, they don't want things to get worse, and so they're not happy about seeing any sort of protest. The other possibility is of saying, well, let's use violence against violence. Let's use counter-violence. If they're going to use aggression against us, let's use aggression against them. And King says that that's not actually going to work. For the one thing, these guys have more force. So if you want to make it just a matter of force, they're probably going to win. For another thing, remember what nonviolent action was supposed to do. Dramatization of the situation. How do things look from the outside when you have people who are saying, let's just use violence, if they're going to lynch us, let's lynch them. If they're going to destroy our shops, let's destroy their shops. Well, when other people look at it from the outside, they're not going to align themselves with this way of protesting, and they're going to say, see, those are the bad guys. Let's keep them down. Nonviolent resistance has the possibility of actually bringing in other people, of making them see, yeah, I shouldn't be a moderate. This is actually wrong. I need to take a position and support the civil rights struggle. Perhaps pacifying this group, perhaps empowering this group, perhaps even reaching some of the segregationists eventually, once some of the other whites start saying, boy, you're really too far with this sort of stuff. Maybe they start to become insecure and they start to say, maybe I am wrong about this. Maybe I need to look at what I'm doing. And eventually it can lead to a radically changed situation. But King thinks that this is only really possible when all of these other things are kept in mind. That if the nonviolent movement becomes violent, that it will just replicate the same sort of oppression as it's fighting against.